Bible. Now, you've already alluded to the fact, but for Rosalind's sake, no class next week because I have to be in Lubbock. And in as much as all three students who have shown up are auditing, we have a little bit of breathing space. Tonight, we are in, and it might help if I was looking at Esther instead of Ezra, but we're in Esther chapter 2. I had my little marker in Ezra and just opened it there, and I was just about to start in Ezra chapter 2, which would have been awkward, to put it mildly. Chapter 2 is where we actually are introduced to Esther. And in this first section, first paragraph, really, the first 4 verses, Brother Chuck Horner describes this as a beauty pageant, which I guess that's probably as good an analogy to what they did as anything here. The thing that perhaps should stand out is that Vashti, former queen, former wife, primary wife, had been a very pleasing wife, evidently, up until the time she said, no, I'm not coming in there and act like a fool just because you got a bunch of drunken friends in there, or words to that effect. And his nobles had persuaded him, what do we do about this? Well, write it down. Thus and such and so and so. Depose the queen. Well, if it's written down, there's no turning back. There's no going back. So does the king ever have the sense that he's been maneuvered into a position he might not like? I don't know. I don't think I would want to have been one of his advisors when he sobered up, because he would begin to think about that. When the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her, and the king's young men who attended him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king. That statement, he remembered, is more than just he remembered the facts of that particular situation, but rather everything leading up to that. He had, in a sense, divested himself of his favorite companion. Had she died, his widowhood would have been a source of public mourning. Had this been a modern relationship and he had divorced her in a fit of pique or a fit of rage, his inclination might have been to go back. Or had he banished her, it might have been to recall her. You remember with David and Absalom, when Absalom is finally allowed to come back to the court, David still won't see him. And this continues on for several years until he finally enlists Joab to reconcile the two of them in a sense, at least bring them back together publicly. Here you have the ruler of the world, basically, the ruler of the Persian Empire. Now, the Greeks have already inflicted some significant pain and changed the balance of power in the political and military realm. But you have a king here whose favorite, does he maintain a harem of other wives? Most likely. That is the custom of that ancient time. And so in that respect, he's probably not been isolated and alone in terms of any kind of physical affection. But regardless of that, his favorite is gone. And she's gone in a way where she can't be recalled, can't be retrieved. Now, what became of her? I haven't got the foggiest idea. Was she put out of the harem, never allowed to see him again? Perhaps. There's nothing to indicate here that she was executed or anything like that, but she was put away in the sense of being permanently removed from his companionship. The thing about it is that cuts both ways. She no longer is his favorite, but he also no longer has her company. So let's have a beauty pageant. Let's find a replacement. Why? We might be inclined to ask, well, surely he could, in a manner of speaking, promote from within, just go to the harem and pick out another one. And if that sounds callous, well, that was a rather callous way of life and a rather callous outlook in that time and place. Remember that women in this setting were basically property, not people, as far as men of power were concerned. And so let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Shushan, the capital, under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch in charge of the women. Okay, well, that tells you right there, he does maintain pardon the expression, a stable of women, if not wives, concubines, shall we say. In that respect, I don't know if we want to say he's in good company, but he certainly has company. He's in the same mold as David and Solomon and pretty much every other potentate of the ancient world, keeping a whole retinue of courtesans, paramours available to him. But now let's just bring in a new generation. Let's find young ones. Well, when does this take place? He and his nobles had gathered to take counsel about what to do about the Greeks, seemingly. He's been on the throne for several years. He's going to reign from roughly 486 to about 465, 21 years. So this would place this time frame somewhere in the probably 480, 479, that general time frame. He's been king for several years. How old is he at this point? We don't know with absolute certainty, but he is a grown man, 30s, 40s, possibly into his 50s. So the appeal here in many ways is an appeal to vanity, an appeal to fleshly desire, fresh, young stable of women for his entertainment. But notice the summary of this at verse 4. Let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This pleased the king, and he did so. So the aim of this is to displace the former queen in his attention, in his memory, in his affections, to basically to distract him from any fond memories of his former queen. She was a very beautiful woman. Go back into chapter 1. He proposed to display her extraordinary beauty. We need to distract the king from those memories. When the king ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. Well, we then come to something that in the next paragraph, which is just begins at verse 5, goes down to verse 11. But in verses 5, 6, and 7, we come to something that raises a lot of questions in the 21st century in Western thinking, and something that in the minds of some is a real problem morally here. So you pick up at verse 5. There was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah. So that tells us how long he's been there. His ancestors had been carried away in 597. So his family roots go back at this point 125 years at least in Persian residency. So he's one of those Jews who for several generations, he's about the third or fourth generation who could have conceivably returned to Judea, and for whatever reason chose not to. He's got a long history there, multiple generations. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. Now, what happened to her parents? No clue. No clue. Nothing is said of her parents, but as presumably the nearest kinsman, he has assumed the role of Gaal, of redeemer, not in the sense of redeeming any inheritance, but in the sense of taking care of this orphaned child. Notice it says she had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. This is the English Standard translation of it. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So that would seem to imply that he is older, probably a sibling to her father, possibly the mother. The relationship between them is that of parent and child, guardian and child. Whether he is uncle or great uncle, some translations describe him as cousin. That description in this English Standard is not 100% certain in terms of their relationship. There may be others in the lineage who are not mentioned here. Now, this man has accepted a responsibility for a young woman. And he's about to do something that is, by our perception of things, astonishing and immoral, at least by modern standards. Because in verse 8, when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa the citadel in the custody of Hegai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Hegai, who had charge of the women. Now, how did she come into this situation? Was she snatched off the street? There's no indication of the mechanism. Go back to the first verses, to verse 2. Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king. Well, was she abducted? That would not be out of character for the crudity of that culture. But there were laws, and this woman does have a guardian with whom someone would have to reckon. The king could conceivably say, I want that one, and just snatch her up. But there's nothing here that indicates that he is any part of this gathering of these young women. They're being gathered for his consideration later on. There's going to be a whole process involved before this woman ever meets the king. Was she enrolled? Did she under the tutelage of Mordecai, did she apply for the position, so to speak? We don't know. But as we go along, the young woman pleased him. Now that's Haggai. Haggai is a eunuch, so she did not please him in any sexual way at all. But she won his favor. He provided her quickly with cosmetics, portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Esther had not made known to her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. Okay. Now here's a little bit of a puzzlement. She is still in communication with Mordecai. She has been added to the gathering of these young women for the king. There would be no illusions. Do you need a? Okay. There would be no illusions on the part of Esther or Mordecai or anybody else for that matter as to what is going to transpire in the course of her life. Being gathered into the king's harem precludes the possibility that she is going to marry for love, or that Mordecai is going to find her a husband and she'll just have a normal life and children and family and whatnot. She has become at this point property of the king to be used at the king's pleasure. She may or may not, at this particular point, become his queen. We know, of course, we know the end of the story. But at best, she will end up being the favorite wife of a polygamous king. Or if none of the others are considered anything more than playthings for him, she will become the wife of an adulterous king. And we can look back at this and recognize the culture of the time, the custom of the time, the status of women in the circumstance that she has effectively no rights and no say in this arrangement. If she were abducted into it, she certainly has no say in the matter. But the troubling thing seems to be the resignation, if that's what it is, or the approval, if that's the case, or maybe even the assistance of Mordecai in bringing her into this situation. He commanded her not to make her identity, her family background, her faith known. We have a couple of issues here. One is the morality of the situation that we've sort of outlined in general terms. The other is this idea of her concealing her identity as a Jew. And in the 21st century, by modern scholarship's estimation of things, the one is as offensive, as wrong, as bad as the other. It's as bad for her to be in this seemingly immoral relationship with the king as it is for her to conceal her identity. Why is she not open and outward and above board about, I am a Jewish woman and this is not proper for a Jewish woman, and so on and so forth.
So it's not really revealed, why he did that, is it?
No, it's not. And there is an assumption among some of late 20th and 21st century scholarship about Mordecai and motivations here, that is merely that, an assumption. If you look at the textbook, the NIV, what is this? What is this textbook? Forgive me if the picture goes all wonky for a minute. If you look at this particular commentary, the NIV application commentary on Esther by Karen Jobes, and that may be displaying backwards on the screen.
Oh, no, I can see it.
Okay. Jobes she's a well-known scholar, and actually from a scholarship point of view, she's a pretty good scholar, pretty conservative overall. But she points out that this is, by 21st century standards, this hiding of the identity is as much an issue morally as the questions about the relationship aspect of this morally. And so we look here, and she's in communication with Mordecai. Why would he command her to conceal her identity when her identity might conceivably have freed her from that dilemma? Well, number one, there's nothing in history or in scripture that suggests that her being a Jew would have given her an out from this potential relationship with the king. Prejudice has existed in pretty much every human culture on every continent through every age, pretty much since the beginning of time, in one form or another, whether it's racial or religious or cultural, chauvinistic, or what have you. Those things have been a feature of human existence throughout history. There's nothing here that indicates that this was ever a problem for the Jews as far as the way that the Babylonians or the Medo-Persians looked at them. Now, when Alexander comes along with the Greeks, there will be a distinct attitude of disdain by the Greeks toward the Jews, but that revolves around philosophy versus religion and personal morality. The Greeks were famously libertine in the way they lived, and they were religious, but they subjugated their religious devotion to their dedication to their philosophy, and they thought that the Jews were very backward and superstitious, and they were determined under Alexander's generals to stamp out Jewish religion because it stood in the way of their converting these people to their way of thinking. And so that was the source of their, shall we say, prejudice against the Jews. But coming back to Esther, there's nothing of that at this point. Now notice the summary of the paragraph down here at verse 11. Every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. So they have communication, whether it's direct or indirect, and here it seems to be indirect by observation or perhaps through a servant of the harem or what have you. nevertheless, they are in communication. He does know what's going on in her life. And so during this time period, what's going on in her life? Well, she is in the harem. She is being groomed to be a consort to the king, a companion to the king. We could explore what would be involved in that, but I think there's no need to go into that detail. But you come to verse 12, when her turn comes. Go back to the beginning of chapter 2 for a moment. Verse 2, let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king from all the provinces of his kingdom. 127 provinces going back to chapter 1 and verse 1. He's got quite an assortment to choose from. Let's just put it that way. How long will it take for Esther to percolate to the top of the list? Who knows? Now, we do know that Haggai, the eunuch who's in charge of this whole situation, favors her. She is a beautiful young woman. From the outside looking at her, she's got everything that the king could want. But notice it says she won his favor, verse 9. So it's more than just her appearance that he's considering. It seems that she's easy to get along with. She's not high maintenance, you might say. She does not seem to object to her change in circumstances. If she does, there's no record of it. If she chose to be there, certainly there'd be no objection. If she went willingly. Regardless, however much time passes, whether it's days, weeks, months, a year, eventually her turn to spend time with the king arrives. Now, there's been a year just for the purification of the women. 12 months for the purification of the women. Well, what's the object of the exercise here? You look at verses 12 and 13 and 14. This was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and ointments for women. When the young women went into the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired. Young woman, she was given whatever she was desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening, she would go in, and in the morning, she would return to the second harem in the custody of Shaashgaz, the king's eunuch who's in charge of the concubines. Well, that tells us pretty much what this arrangement is. She's going to spend a year in purification, in preparation. Now, how much more time than that till she percolates to the top of the list? I don't think that the king is probably interviewing 10 virgins a day. The passage of the year is customary, was customary, not just among the Persians, but going back even to the Egyptians, basically as a way of ensuring that none of these women, none of the women in the king's harem ever came in bearing another man's child. Had they come in already pregnant, even though not showing yet, with that much time passing, they're going to show and deliver before they ever spend time with the king, which ensures that no imposter or pretender to the throne has any access in that way. So there is method to the madness in a sense. But notice you have the description of the preparations. She's given whatever she wants. That would be clothing, cosmetics, jewelry, what have you, whatever is available. And she does not return to Haggai's custody at this point. She returns to the second harem in the custody of Shaashgaz. And at this point, she is not in the pool of contenders. She is in the pool of concubines. And the clear implication here is that night, she spends the night with the king in a conjugal way. Now, through all of this, Mordecai and Esther have been in relatively close communication. Her identity as a Jewish girl would have been no advantage to her. Whether or not it would be a hindrance, perhaps, is debatable. But regardless, Mordecai has said, don't identify yourself, don't reveal who you are. You're going to be there at least a year. You pick up then at verse 15, and from verse 15 to verse 20, now we have the record of Esther's turn at bat, so to speak. When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter, to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. Now, Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. A couple of things here. She has access to whatever she wants. Like I said, clothing and ornaments and perfume or whatever, oils, things that would, whatever she thought would make her attractive and desirable. Pause for just a second there. The law did not allow for a woman to how shall I say this? The law, under normal circumstances, would look at a woman in this circumstance as immoral, as guilty of fornication. In this circumstance, however, what did she become when she set foot in the king's harem? Just like David's wives, just like Solomon's collection of women, she became the property of the king. Now, we can debate till the cows come home whether this is right and appropriate. What is God's design for the relationship between man and woman? Genesis 2:24, one man married to one woman for life. Exceptions, death, and unfaithfulness, divorce due to unfaithfulness. We have a consistent record of individuals, though, going all the way back to Esau, for example, coming down through the judges to the time of kings. We have a consistent record of individuals who practiced polygamy, men who had more than one wife at a time. Esau had at least three, two that he married before Jacob ever left home, and they were grief of mind to his parents. And then we have even Levites with more than one wife in the time of the judges. Of course, We look at the kings, and there's all sorts of mischief in those days. How do we reconcile that? How do we reconcile the idea that Esther can be a righteous woman in this situation?
It wasn't against the morals of the world.
Okay.
But it was against God's ideal.
Okay. Number one, it was not an offense in the overall perspective of the society. It certainly was not an issue for the Persians as far as their king was concerned. Yeah. He's the king. He can do within limits. He can do whatever he wants. There were laws, and he was bound by the laws as long as they were written down. But there seemingly was nothing that prohibited this, and this was a custom for kings of long standing, not just among the Persians. It is not an offense against the generally accepted morality of the society, which doesn't have any bearing whatever on God's definition of morality. How do we square this with the law?
How do you square David's situation with the law and Solomon's situation with the law?
Okay. And the answer to that, you can't. Except, what does Paul observe? The times of ignorance, Acts 17, God overlooked, God winked at. There were things that happened in ancient times that God tolerated. But God tolerating something in the short term in no way suggests that God approves of it in the long term.
Jesus made a statement because of the hardness of their heart.
Yeah.
That
Well,
God allowed, or Moses allowed them
yes.
to get writings of divorcement.
In Matthew 19, the question about divorce, and in that context of Matthew 19, the scribes and the Pharisees were asking more, whose school of thought do you line up with, Hillel or Shammai? Or there was one other, Akiba, another one that was way out in left field. Whose school of thought do you line up with? Do you agree with us, or do you agree with us? And what did Jesus do? He schooled them all and took them back to Genesis 2 and said, from the beginning, this was not God's design. Well, why did Moses command? And he said, Moses did not command. Moses allowed. Moses permitted something because of what you were already doing, which was abusing your wives, abusing your women. And that was the writing of divorcement. God tolerating something is not the same as God approving of something. If that were the case, then we'd have to, if we want to make the case that God tolerating something means he approves of it, well, then God must approve of all manner of sin, because sin exists in the world and God allows sin to exist in the world. What proves too much proves nothing. So we can't look at this and say the fact that God allowed this to happen means he approved of it. God tolerated it. God permitted this to occur. He did not prevent it from occurring. That does not necessarily indicate endorsement of it. So she can have whatever she wants. It's her night. It's a given that from this night forward, she is not one of the virgins in the harem anymore. She's now a concubine. The king will have what he wants of her. It says something about her character that she does not set out to seduce him. She takes what is advised. The eunuch, Haggai, who has charge of these young women, seems to be a man who knows the king well, knows his interests, his tastes, what pleases him, what doesn't please him. And so she takes what she's told to in terms of clothing and decoration and so forth. Now you come to verse 15. When Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus in his royal palace, in the 10th month, the month of Tebet, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So she wins the contest in a manner of speaking. Did he select her in that very day, that very night? I don't know. How much time passed, if not? Did he go all the way to the end of all the virgins of 127 provinces before he says, that's the one that will be my God? I don't know. Suffice it to say that at least in the perspective of all the Jews, any shame that might have been associated with her as one in the group of concubines, as a shall we say, as a plaything for the king, any shame that would have attached to her in that context would be removed by her being made queen, because it would be understood as queen, she is wife. She may not be his only wife, but as queen, she is the number one wife. She's the legitimate wife. And therefore, any child she bears, any son she bears, becomes what? Heir to the throne. You don't get much more legitimate in the perspective of the people than that, both Persians and Jews. So she is selected to be queen. Now, this is 4 years after the feast that was mentioned in chapter 1. This is 4 years after Vashti is deposed. So he has been without his favorite for 4 years. The discussion that takes place at the beginning of chapter 2, what do we do about that? Well, that's over a year before. So this has been a lengthy process. History tells us that it's after the time that he has gone to war with Greece. The feast, the summoning of the nobles, the conclave of chapter 1, as we talked about, seems to have been a time of discussion. What shall we do about the Greeks rising and so forth? We need to go to war with them. Now, there's a huge defeat already in the offing here. Why would he wait 3 years to miss the queen? Well, he's been gone. He's been at war during this time period. He hasn't had time really to think about, oh, I miss Vashti. Now he has gone to war. He has been defeated. He has been humiliated in battle. He has come back home. He will make some other efforts later on historically and suffer because of them, which accords with Daniel's prophecy. Daniel foretells that the goat will push the ram. Well, Ahasuerus is the ram. Alexander, of course, Ahasuerus is the great grandfather of the ram, basically, and Alexander is the goat 100 years down the road. But this conflict is going to go on, off and on for years. So he comes back. Now he's ready to spend some time at home, lick his wounds, be made to feel better after being defeated. What better way to do that? Well, let's find a pretty girl Esther turns out to be the pretty girl and is made queen. So come down here at verse 19, verse 18. The king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. It was a celebration in her honor, basically. He granted remission of taxes to the provinces, gave gifts with royal generosity. This is a PR stunt as much as it is a celebration of the queen, because what has just happened in their history? The greatest empire that the world has thus far known has just had its nose bloodied by a bunch of upstart Greeks who don't even believe in kings. And so these actions, the remission of taxes and the big feast, the celebration of a new queen, from a political standpoint, this is designed to distract the people and the nobles from the fact that we just got whooped. Still a mighty empire. I can afford to give you a tax break. Still a mighty king. I can afford to give. Look at all these extravagant gifts that I can give. And there's a lot of truth to that. He's been defeated militarily 1,000 miles away or 600, 700 miles away, but his empire is still sound. His generals are not too bright, but his empire is still intact. So this certainly is going to go down well for most people. But in verses 19 and 20, when the virgins were gathered a second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people, as Mordecai had commanded her. She obeyed Mordecai just as she was brought up, as when she was brought up by him. So even though she is now the king's property, she still pays attention to the counsel of her kinsmen. We don't know what the second gathering of virgins here is. There's no explanation for this. Is this where he has chosen her to be queen and sorted them out and is sent off, sends them off to the harem or something? I don't know. There is no explanation except that this occurs. But her communication line with Mordecai still revolves around his being able to come to the gate of their court and communicate with her through somebody. Undoubtedly, it would be through some intermediary. Mordecai would be recognizable in the society of that time by dress, by behavior. He would be recognizable as a Jew. She would not necessarily. Most all women would have been in public, veiled or hooded, covered for the most part. So she would not have been significantly different in appearance before being taken into the harem than any other woman. But Mordecai's dress and his associations, the places that he went, his behavior, that would have marked him out clearly as a Jew. So she can't just go talk to him at the gate, most likely. They have to communicate through intermediaries. There is no reason that they cannot communicate. Her being a part of the harem does not cloister her from all, seclude her from all communication, as far as we know. But she still is not revealing her nationality. In those days, though, as Mordecai is sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of his eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Now, those names have already appeared. You go back to chapter 1, and they're mentioned there as being among his eunuchs and his advisors. But the thing that's missing here is why. What was it that excited their irritation with him, their anger with him? No clue, except that they were angry. Mordecai learns of what they're plotting. How does he learn? I don't know. Did he overhear? Was he a witness to their complaints? Did he hear from someone else? Did he have a reliable source? The mechanics of it are not specified, but the gist of it is, two of the king's trusted men are plotting against him. It may very well be that this has something to do with the recent military defeat. We don't know. But this comes to Mordecai's knowledge, and what does he do with the information? He sends the information to the queen. The queen tells the king, and evidently mentions his name. Now, does she tell the king, this is my kinsman? No indication that she does. But there is a record made. This man uncovered this information. This was made known to the king. An investigation was made. These two men were discovered to be plotting against the king. And so they're executed. And the last thing we find in chapter 2 is it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. Information came in, and we might look at this and say, why would information come through the queen? Except that palace intrigue, that's the thread that Mordecai can pull. He has a connection there, and he can send word to her. Do they question then, why do you know this man? Or is there a record? She is this man's kinswoman. Don't know. Regardless, her identity has not yet been revealed as a Jewish woman. That raises another question of sorts, and this is something that Ms. Jobs touches on in her writing on the subject. If Esther is a Jewish woman, and she is, how is it that her identity, her religious identity, is not exposed by her practicing of her faith in the palace, in the harem, in the presence of the king, in amongst the concubines, amongst the servants? How can she keep her identity hidden?
It was primarily the males that had to do
Okay.
things under the law.
In terms of active, visible participation in worship, it was the men who took the lead. Could this woman pray? Certainly. Could she read the scriptures? Probably not, because there would have been little, if any, reason for a Jewish woman in that era to learn to read. She could always ask Uncle Mordecai growing up to read to her if he had a copy of the scriptures or any part of it, or to tell her what he had read in the synagogue. Had she had a husband and family at home, then she would have taken a larger role in the Sabbath observances. But in the absence of a husband or a father figure in her life in the palace, what could she do on the Sabbath except, in effect, lie low and pray quietly? nothing else would be required on a functional level of her in terms of her worship in that respect. So her identity as a Jewish woman is still unknown, at least as far as being common knowledge. Mordecai is known as the man who exposed the plot. The plot's investigated, the eunuchs are executed, case closed. Until later on. It's a quarter till. This would be a good place to stop and take a break. And so we'll resume at 8 o'clock. And our class will be understandably a little shorter tonight because I was late. Thoughts or comments? Is that each introduction to the New Testament next semester, which is something I've never taught before, as a whole. And so I was in the library looking to see what books were in there by way of introduction. Aside from the fact that there are some wonderful old books in there. There's a volume on the text of the New Testament by Milligan and somebody else whose name I recognized. That is an original from 1850 something, and it's inscribed by one of the authors to Reverend so-and-so in a beautiful hand with a fountain pen. But they're of the textbooks, the introductions to the New Testament that are still available now, there are none of those in the library because they're all too new. And I have a couple on order that I want to examine to use as textbooks, but they've not yet arrived, but they're on their way.
Does that contemplate a study of in the fullness of time God sent forth his son?
Well, amongst other things,
Yeah.
certainly that should cover both the
We're gonna wind up early because we start early.
right.
Are you able to close tonight, or
Yes.
I can stay around?
Yeah, I can set the alarm and everything, no problem.
We
And
closed last week.
I got Roger here, so yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're good. See you, Gary. Now that should cover everything from the, as you say, the fullness of time to the things like the synoptic problem and textual issues and so forth. How thoroughly I will be able to cover all that in 15 weeks, I don't know, but we'll give it a go at any rate. And that's one of those classes for which there will just about have to be a specified text just to cover the material. Anyhow, let's get back to Esther chapter 3, and as I said, let's hatch a plot against the Jews. So, after these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. Who is this guy? Well, he gave this man the most important advisory position in the kingdom. He became, in effect, the king's personal emissary, his right-hand man. He is going to be empowered to speak for the king. And so that tells us a good bit about him right here. He would be given honor by normal folks, just like the king himself. Mordecai is not going to show to this man the kind of honor that is due only to the Lord. Mordecai, under normal circumstances, will never come into the presence of the king. So there's it's a moot point as to whether he would bow down to the king, because under normal circumstances, he'd never be in the king's presence. In the Persian culture, this degree of worship, of honor, is due to the king because in their thinking, he is divine. Now, he is not necessarily God on earth, but he is the incarnation. He is God's representative, in a manner of speaking, the incarnation of the god Oromasdes, which is a Persian deity. And Haman expects to have the same, he's the representative of God, I'm his representative, I expect to be treated just like he is. And he is, number two, he is in Ahasuerus's kingdom, he is in the same position basically that Joseph was to Pharaoh in the kingdom. There's nobody who outranks him but the king himself. And so all the folks that normally interact with him bow down. The servants at the king's gate bowed down, paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. Mordecai did not bow down. Now, where is Mordecai? Nothing is said about his occupation up to this point. We know that he is the kinsman who has taken care of and raised Esther. But what did he do for a living? Where was he? He seemingly lived in Shushan or somewhere in the vicinity, but there's nothing said of his occupation. Is he a priest? Is he a scribe? Is he a carpenter? Don't know.
Wouldn't have been a priest because he was a Benjamite, right?
Okay, he's a Benjaminite, so he's not a priest, but there's nothing said of his occupation. There's nothing that indicates, that suggests that he's a functionary or an advisor to the king in any way. He doesn't come into the king's presence. He has to send word about the plot of these eunuchs through Esther to get it to the king. So he's not someone who has interaction with the king. But as Haman passes to and fro, somewhere along the way, here's Mordecai not bowing down and worshiping. And word gets back. Why do you transgress the command, Haman? Verse 3, the king's servants at the king's gate said to Mordecai, I said, Haman, why do you transgress the king's command, Mordecai? They spoke to him day after day, and he would not listen to them. And after he would not listen to them, they told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. Now, why do you not bow down, Mordecai? Simple answer, because I'm a Jew. In that statement, there was an explanation that should have been sufficient for anybody. Throughout history, the Assyrians had taken away the 10 tribes. They had been unfaithful to God. They couldn't claim we're Jewish or we're Hebrew, and therefore it's understood that we don't worship your gods, because what were they doing? They'd instituted their own idolatry. They had imported the idolatry of Jezebel from Tyre and Sidon, the Baalim and the Asherim and so forth. So they not only would not be expected to stand up for God by the peoples around them, they had no history of standing up for God. The children of Judah, though, the kingdom of Judah, southern kingdom, comes into captivity, not to the Medo-Persians originally, but to whom? The Babylonians. And who has been one of the chief Babylonian advisors from the get-go, basically. Daniel. Daniel has been accused and tried and tested on the basis of his faith. His companions, his fellows, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, the same way. They have set a precedent, which may have been very uncomfortable for some of the other Jews in Babylonian captivity, but nevertheless, they have set a precedent that they will be good, loyal, faithful Babylonian servants. They will keep the Babylonian kings and the Babylonian government and the Babylonian empire's best interests at heart in everything they do, except they're not going to compromise their faith in favor of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar has to eat grass a while before he figures out that it is to his advantage to pay attention not to the God of Israel, but to the faith of the God of Israel's people. Basically, hands off. Let them do their thing. They're good for us. When the Persians take over in 539 down to 536, leading to the return, they inherit not just the Jews, they inherit Daniel. And so the ancestors of the current king, Ahasuerus, they have a precedent already in place that these Jews are good for us as long as we don't demand that they compromise their faith. And nothing that the Persians do in the intervening generations seems to challenge that basic precedent. Nothing that's recorded in scripture at any rate. In fact, quite the opposite. When Cyrus sends Zerubbabel back, what does he send? Funds and the vessels of the temple and approval. We'll get down past Ahasuerus to Artaxerxes, and when the wall is built, when he sends Nehemiah, Ezra goes, and then he sends Nehemiah with a military escort and sends him as the governor. It's to the advantage of the Persians. In this setting, in Esther's period, there's nothing here that suggests any kind of problem or objection or animosity on the part of the Persians toward the Jews and their religion. And the Persians, as an empire, were much more easygoing about the religious convictions of the people that they governed than the Babylonians or the Assyrians or the Syrians before them had been. You see that in Cyrus's decree, for example. But we're not, the key thing here is we're not dealing with a Persian. Haman is one of the conquered peoples. He's not an Israelite. He's described as an Agagite. Now, does this connect him to Agag, the king of Amalek? Probably not. But he is a conquered, his background is one of the conquered people. To have risen to the point that he is now number 2 man in the kingdom, he undoubtedly considers himself a Persian, but he has no patience for the faith, much less the utility of a Jew who would serve his king faithfully as long as he doesn't have to compromise his faith. So here,
Why?
go
I
ahead.
just have a question. Why would Haman being an Agagite?
Mm-hmm.
Why would that not be a connection between him and King Agag back in the days of Saul.
Let me pop up the text in this. If memory serves me, let me get this up where I can see it clearly. If memory serves me, that term is not, well, now this gives it as a patronymic from Agag, a subject of Agag. So from some of what I have read, that connection is not there. The Hebrew language, that name seems to derive from that, but consider the time frame involved here. Agag and the Amalekites, how far back is that from here? You go back to the days of King Saul. We're back to 1 Samuel chapter 15. From there to here is 500 years, basically. The Amalekites were basically wiped out by Saul. Agag was slaughtered by Samuel. There is no indication of any descendants surviving at that point. This terminology, that name, I need to, I'll now that you've asked that, I'll have to go back and reread some of what I have read in the past about this. If memory serves me, that name has more significance than just a descendant of Agag as one possible explanation for it. And off the top of my head, I can't tell you. The more I think about it, the farther away it recedes into my mind. But regardless, this man is having none of the excusing the Jews line of thinking that the Persians were very open to. He is, and we see this throughout everything we read about him. He's all about his ego. He's all about his reputation. He's all about his position. In chapter 2, we saw Bigthan and Teresh investigated and executed for plotting against the king. In chapter 3, we're introduced to a man who, left to his own devices, would almost certainly have become dangerous to the king because his ego would have led him in that direction. So the challenge here is that Mordecai has managed all this time, as any faithful Jew would have, to maintain his religious conviction without having it really put to the test in this particular respect. When Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, he was filled with fury, verse 5 says. Now, his advisors, the servants with whom Mordecai interacts, the folks that know him, what do they know about him? He's a Jew. Enough said. Jews are some of the Babylonians and some of the Persians' most faithful bureaucrats. Their prophet, Jeremiah, had commanded them in the name of God, pray for the welfare of the city where you are, work for the benefit of the Babylonian and the subsequent Persian Empire. Be content where you are. And it seems that by and large, they had done that. It took them a while to get used to the idea, but they've settled. They've integrated. The Babylonian Persian Jews become a center of Jewish culture, a center of Jewish learning and education. The Babylonian Talmud comes out of this tradition of scholarship that stayed put in Babylon and Persia long after they could have returned to Judah. So it seems that by and large, they've done what Jeremiah told them to do. In that context, then, Mordecai's behavior would not have been particularly surprising to a lot of people. But this man has an ego. Ego is a funny thing. Ego is not bad in itself. God created ego. What is ego? It's hard to define. Ego is a sense of self. Ego is a degree of confidence in one's own ability. It takes and I have tried to always make this point in teaching preachers in the homiletics classes. It takes a certain degree of ego or self-confidence or a certain degree of, I guess you'd say, self-presence just to have the nerve to stand in a pulpit before a congregation and say, here's what the Bible says you ought to do. Well, who are you to tell me? I'm preaching the word of God. It takes a certain amount of ego just to have the nerve to do that. But ego left unchecked will be the ruin of a preacher. Every single time, sooner or later. Ego is not a bad thing by itself, but any characteristic allowed to control, fear allowed to control all our decisions, does what? It will immobilize us to the point that it will lead us away from God and immobilize us. Pride. Knew an old Jamaican sister years ago who used to object when someone would say of children, I'm proud of you. And I understand what she was saying, and I about halfway agree with her. She said, don't use that word pride. If you're proud, you stink in the nostrils of God. Well, she had a point, because pride is not something, it's not a word, it's not a concept that is used in a favorable way in the scriptures. But we also understand in the English language, when we say to a child, I am proud of you for, we're not expressing a sense of arrogance or haughtiness. We're expressing what? A sense of appreciation, of gratitude, of approval. And it's, in one sense, it's unfortunate that we choose to use that word pride to convey that. Now, 21st century Western culture, pride has taken on a connotation that in practical terms is much more akin to its actual biblical usage, which is arrogance and haughtiness and overweening sense of self when we talk about pride parades and pride days and so forth in that particular context. But that is a context that has perverted all sorts of things. Here, we have a man who has allowed one aspect of his personality to dominate everything else about him. It has become the defining characteristic of him.
And one person to
Yes.
set him off.
In much the way a former politician lives rent-free in the heads of many current politicians of the opposite position, this man allows Mordecai to live rent-free in his head. And Mordecai has done nothing that is intentionally calculated, as far as we can see, to tweak him, to offend him, to excite his ire. The thing we could say through this is that Mordecai he's just been Mordecai, as far as we can tell. There's no suggestion here that Mordecai is in any way defiant or arrogant about this. It's just matter of fact. This is who he has always been. He's never been perhaps in this position of someone expecting him to do this, but he's a Jew in a otherwise religiously very tolerant environment. And this man's intolerance is the exception to the rule. So he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Now Haman has the authority of the king. Haman is the number 2 man in the kingdom. He can do within the boundaries of Persian law and the king's approval. He can do pretty much whatever he pleases. And he could very well have ordered Mordecai's arrest, perhaps even Mordecai's execution. But it tells us something about the character of the man, the venality, the smallness of his character, that it doesn't satisfy him to make an example of just Mordecai. And so he plots to destroy all Jews. We find this man described as an Agagite, and we wonder, okay, does this in some way connect him back to Agag and the Amalekites, which that's debatable at best. But if he is, certainly Saul's behavior toward them, even though it was commanded by God, Saul's behavior toward them would certainly explain some of his animosity, perhaps. But we look at this and we also kind of wonder, I wonder if he had any surviving descendants that were related to Hitler, somebody like that. Because the same attitude of destroy the people as a whole is present. This man is not going to be satisfied just to eliminate Mordecai. If this man will not bow down to me, then he and everyone related to him, well, that's the whole of the Jewish people, should be made to pay the price. Now, Haman seems to think that Mordecai's refusal to bow down to him because he's a Jew would extend to every other Jew in the empire, that no Jew would bow down to him. Or it may be that he thinks, all right, this man is setting a bad precedent and these people will become rebellious toward me. And I am the king's emissary, therefore they'll be rebellious to the king. I believe we'd be reading too much into this if we extend this out to the point that he's looking out for the king's interests. These whole people will become rebellious. Everything else we read about this man points to his own sense of himself, his own sense of his self-importance. So, verses 7 through 11, the plot. What shall we do? The first month, Nisan, the 12th year of King Ahasuerus. Time has passed. 5 years that Esther has been queen now. They cast pure, that is, they cast lots before Haman day after day. They cast it month after month until the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. He's looking for an auspicious day to bring this to the king. Astrology played a huge part in Persian life, in Persian thinking, in Persian decision making. Now, we go back to chapter 1, we talk about the king's feast and how they would get drunk. And basically that historically their pattern was get everybody as drunk as they can and everybody give their ideas while they're drunk. And then when we sober up, the ones that make sense are the ones we keep and the ones we don't are the ones we throw out. But the next step in that process then would be to take the ideas that they kept and put them to the astrologers and see if it falls on what's the best day for this to take place or what have you. This is what Haman is doing through the course of the whole year. He's looking for the best day to present his plan, his accusation, his plot to the king. Why does he want to involve the king in this? He's got the king's authority. He's the number 2 man. Why does he need the king's approval?
And these people may be important to the king.
Okay. Number 1, if Daniel set any precedent, which we would seem to think that he does, what Haman has in mind is going to rattle the kingdom, if only on a bureaucratic level. But number 2, as the number 2 man in the kingdom, he surely could have just ordered Mordecai's execution and been done with it. But he wants to wipe out a whole people. How many Jews are in the world at this point in time? We really don't know. We know that Zerubbabel led 50,000 back to Jerusalem 50 some odd years before this. And that they were just a token of the Jews in captivity. What Haman is planning and trying to facilitate here is nothing less than wholesale genocide of some of the people who were valuable assets to the Persian Empire, and not just the bureaucrats, but the tradespeople, farmers, keepers of vineyards, herdsmen, people practicing all sorts of trades, people involved in literature, in record keeping, in accounting. What Haman is plotting would have on one level devastated the empire to some degree, intellectually and economically. When we get down here, we're going to find I'll pay 10,000 talents of silver. I'll bear the cost of some of this. What Haman is doing is trying to mitigate the economic damage that he's about to do. So they cast lots, they try and they look and they look and they look and they look for just the right day. And so the 12th month, Haman says to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered abroad, dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them. Okay. Number 1, he doesn't say who. Had he said Jews, that might very well have set off alarm bells in the king's mind, because he's not that far removed from grandpa or great grandpa Cyrus, who let them go home and build a temple and offer sacrifices on his behalf. Second, Haman projects onto all the people what he considers to be the sin of Mordecai. And he expands the accusation. Now, what is his issue with Mordecai? Mordecai will not bow down to him and worship him like he's a god. What other laws of the Persians has Mordecai violated? None that we see. There's no mention of any others. But the accusation is they disregard the king's laws, plural. What's the implication of Haman's words? The whole of these people are willingly, deliberately, intentionally violating, disregarding, disrespecting every law of the king. That's not true. Their own prophet says, pray for the welfare of the king. But the accusation is couched in terms to make it as damning as possible. But then, third, how does he describe them? Scattered, dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Well, now that's interesting from an archaeological standpoint, an anthropological standpoint, because what does that tell us about the movement of the Jews in captivity and post-captivity? The provinces of Ahasuerus reach from the Indus River in India on the east all the way to the borders, at least, of modern day Turkey, all the way to the Mediterranean Ocean. And from way up in modern day Afghanistan and that area down through Arabia to the borders of Africa, 127 provinces. When Nebuchadnezzar had taken Judah into captivity, where did he settle the majority of the Jews, as far as we can tell? Pretty much around Babylon. And in the intervening generations, they certainly have colonized that area in a sense, because there are huge, historically huge numbers of Jews in that area for hundreds of years, down to the time of Christ and beyond. But they have also percolated out into all of the provinces. Now, the way Haman describes this, we're talking about some piddling little people, that there's just a few people scattered hither, thither, and yon. If there were 50,000 who returned 50 to 60 years before to Judah, there were probably 5 million who didn't. The current population of the United States is somewhere around 340 million people. Well, John?
I got my Stinson on too.
All right.
All right. We'll
Keep
see
your
y'all
head
later.
warm and be careful going home, brother.
I will. I'm going to Denver in the morning.
Travel safely.
I will. See y'all later.
The current population is ballpark 340 million people. 5 million would be a little over 1% of the total population. Would we notice if 5 million Americans just disappeared tomorrow? There would probably not be a single community in the nation that would not notice. What Haman is proposing here, he makes sound like it's just a minor nuisance that he's going to get rid of for the king. You would think that maybe some alarm bells would go off in the king's mind when he comes down here, and after he says they don't keep the king's law and it's not to your profit to tolerate them, if it please the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver Now, a talent of silver is not a small sum. In gross weight, that we're talking about 75 pounds, 10,000 talents, 750,000 pounds of silver. I don't know how much silver there is in the world, but that's a bunch. I'll underwrite the cost of this purging of these people, is what he's saying. Why would the king go along with this?
Probably greedy to some extent.
Well, okay, there's income, except that the 10,000 talents is not just straight into the treasury to enrich the king. It's to underwrite the expense into the hands of those that they may put it to the king's treasury. It's roundabout. I will underwrite this so that your expenses will be reimbursed. Well, Haman's just going to raise taxes to cover that. But why would the king believe this?
In those 5 years, Haman could have proven a trustworthy ally.
Okay. 5 years ago, 2 of the king's most trusted servants plotted to kill him. And they were found out and executed. The moment an individual becomes the leader of a nation, whether he is a king or a dictator or an elected leader, what happens? Somebody is planning to replace him. Joe Biden is president of the United States today, has 2 more years left in this term, says he's going to run again if he gets 4 more years. Tonight, somewhere in the United States, there is somebody planning to replace him, whether it's Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis or somebody that hadn't even bubbled up to the surface yet. Might be Kamala Harris or another Democrat for that matter. Somebody's planning to replace him. The moment a man becomes king or a woman becomes queen, if she has any ruling authority, somebody is plotting to replace that individual. Go back to the book of Nehemiah, and what was Nehemiah's role in Artaxerxes' court before he became governor of Judah? He's the cupbearer to the king. The king doesn't drink anything that Nehemiah doesn't taste first. Why not? That's self-preservation. I'm going to make sure that I'm not, every time Nehemiah takes a drink of whatever the king is going to drink, his life is at risk. So he's got a vested interest in making sure he knows the provenance of everything the king drinks. Go back to Joseph in Egypt, in prison, under Potiphar's warrant. Who are his companions in prison? The baker and the major domo, the chief butler. The baker dreams that his loaves are consumed by the birds. That's not a good omen for him. Because who's responsible for what the king eats? He is. The butler winds up being restored and the baker winds up being executed. This man, Haman, probably literally sits at the king's right hand. He is the #1 advisor. We don't know why the king promoted him, but he's been one among many, and now he's first above he's not first among equals, he's first above everybody else. Has he been a good advisor? Maybe so. One thing about somebody like this is that they tend to be very efficient at looking out for themselves. And if that means looking out for whoever's above them in order to protect themselves, they do it. That's probably how this man came into his position in the first place. But now, he is very possibly the greatest threat to the king. But the king trusts him. I'll pay for this. I'll underwrite this. How would he do that? Does he have this much silver in his own right? Probably not. He would be undoubtedly a wealthy man, but to have that much, to be able to underwrite the genocide of a whole people in all 127 provinces, he probably didn't have that kind of money. The king probably doesn't have that kind of money. How would he acquire it? Taxation. He'll just raise the tax, pay the tax collectors to collect everything that's forfeited by the slain people. That'll cover a big part of it. And he'll raise the taxes on everybody else to make up the difference. And the king agrees. If the man has never steered him wrong thus far, he has no reason not to. Why does he not inquire in more detail? We could condemn him all day for that. But Haman is a man that he trusts. How closely do we question those we trust?
This may have been one of a number of things he proposed at the same time, and or he just may have been, let me just run this idea quickly by you.
Any number of possibilities about the mechanics of it. But up to this point, seemingly, the king appreciates, even if the king knows this guy has an ego, and that would be pretty hard to hide. The king appreciates his ability. He's been if not a good counselor in the moral sense, he has been a proficient counselor up to this point, or so it seems. So the king gives him the signet ring that gives you the authority to do whatever you do in my name. Notice he's described as the enemy of the Jews here. And then the money is given to you, the people also, to do with them as it seems good to you. Haman, here's a blank check that I've signed. You just go do whatever you think is good. This is not the first time we've seen that kind of behavior by a king. In Potiphar's house, the only thing withheld from Joseph was what? Potiphar's wife. In Pharaoh's kingdom, there's no one greater than Joseph, but Pharaoh himself. And Pharaoh doesn't have to trouble his pretty head about anything because Joseph takes care of everything. Moses in the wilderness tried to take care of everything himself, and the people about wore him out. And it took Jethro to say, you need help, Moses. Appoint judges. So we come here to the decree. Notice though at verse 11, basically Haman said, the king says, Haman, you get to keep the spoils. I'm not going to have anyone say that I approved of this for my own personal gain. So, Haman, you just You keep whatever you can make out of this. That's considerable. That would defer a huge part of his offered expense. So you get to the decree in verses 12 through 15, and it's sent by couriers, which would take a minimum of about 3 weeks, fanning out from Shushan to the farthest provinces, to India, to the east, and to the borders of Ethiopia and modern day Turkey and so forth. It would take several weeks for word to get around. The king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month. An edict according to all that Haman commanded was written to the king's satraps and the governors over all the provinces and the officials of all the peoples, to every province in its own script and every people in its own language. So there's no misunderstanding here. Written in the name of King Ahasuerus, sealed with the king's signet ring, letters sent by couriers. And here's the instruction: destroy, kill, annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, on the 13th day of the 12th month. So in 1 month's time, this is what's to be done.
Is it 1 month's time
Or
or is it 11?
It may be 11 months' time at this point, because this is Adar when they proposed this. So it would be a year's time, basically. I say 1 month, and I overlooked that. So it's a year's time to prepare and get everything in place. So wipe them out, plunder their goods. And this is decreed everywhere. The interesting part of this, it's public knowledge, including public to the Jews. What would the Jewish people do when it becomes public knowledge that their destruction has been decreed? What would we assume they would do?
Fast and pray to God.
Fast and pray? What else might they do? Now, if this is a year away, they've got time to leave. The interesting thing is there's no historical reference to any mass migration of Jews away from the Persian Empire during this period. Why not? They were at this point free to travel, free to move. The decree of Cyrus applies to all of them. They can go. Of course, now Judah is, the territory of Judah belongs to the king of Persia. But there's nothing to prevent them picking up and relocating into Greek territory or to Egyptian territory, moving farther east into modern day India. But there's no record of any massive migration of them during this period. And the explanation, I think, comes in chapter 4. As word goes out, plans are being laid to thwart this. Now, do all the people know that? Obviously not. But it won't be long until they do. How long would it take if you decided to pick up and move clear across the country? How long would it take to make those arrangements and carry out that plan in the 21st century? If you were going to sell your properties here and dispose of your business and just relocate to California, how long would it take you to do that? It would, even if you didn't have a job to find or a business to dispose of, if all you had to do was just sell your house and load your personal belongings and your household goods and go find a place there and change banks and change your driver's license, at the very least, it would take you probably a month. And that's with all the conveniences of the 21st century. In this ancient time, to undertake that kind of a move would have required months just to get it underway. Would the Jews during this period have been distressed and upset and terrified and terrorized, perhaps? Absolutely. Anybody that lives under the threat of death, under the threat of the loss of everything, is going to be upset, unsettled. But in the meantime, these people, as you say, fast and pray. And there's a kicker here. There is a specific date. The people that Haman employs, or would have employed for this, are not allowed to touch the Jews before that date. So during the intervening time, in effect, they're safe for that time period. So there's time for things to change. And that's what we see in chapters 4 and 5 and 6. This is a good stopping place for us. So this is where we'll stop. Thoughts or comments? Ms. Roslyn? If not,
Nope.
okay. If not, we will stop here.
One comment.
Okay.
You know, there, from a bureaucratic standpoint, the Jews had been bureaucrats, or a fair number of them were
Yeah.
bureaucrats. That may have led to their dispersal throughout the kingdom.
That certainly is a possibility, because we know that Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were used in much that way. And certainly wherever you had Jews in positions of authority or power, eventually others would be certain to follow. So that, good thought. Because they would have influence and authority to improve the lot of their fellow Jews. And they would be assets in the provincial administration. All right. Well, 2 weeks from tonight, we will pick up in chapter 4.